Shirley Pierce had always stood for fairness. As a Supreme Court judge, she dedicated her life to making sure the law was upheld with integrity, that those without power were given a voice, and that individuals who misuse their authority face consequences. But she never imagined that one day she would return home to find her own son, Jake, unable to leave their house because of a reckless decision made by a group of overconfident bureaucrats. That morning had begun just like any other. She had hurried out the door, balancing her briefcase in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, focused on the long list of cases awaiting her at work. Her schedule was packed, her day structured down to the minute, just as it had been for years. But as soon as she pulled into her driveway that evening, she knew something was wrong. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Normally, Jake would be outside, rolling down the ramp, excited to greet her after a long day. Instead, he was nowhere in sight. Frowning, she stepped out of her car and approached the front of the house, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape, until she stopped cold. The ramp was gone. Not damaged, not under construction, completely gone, as if it had never existed. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind raced. This couldn't be real. There had been no warnings, no notices, no discussions about any issues with the ramp. It had been there that morning, the very structure her son relied on to enter and exit their home, and now it was nothing but an empty space. A spark of fear ignited in her chest as she rushed to the front door and yanked it open, calling for Jake. His voice came from inside, frustration and helplessness clear in his tone. He was stuck. Without the ramp, he had no way to leave the house on his own. Shirley's pulse pounded as she tried to process the reality of the situation. Who would do this? Who would remove a critical accessibility feature without so much as a warning? Then, as her gaze dropped to the envelope taped to the door, she felt her anger flare. It was a notice from the HOA. Bold, cold, impersonal. According to the letter, the ramp had been deemed a violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines and had been removed to preserve the community's visual harmony. As if her son's independence was nothing more than an inconvenience, an eyesore that disrupted the neighborhood's so-called perfect image. Her hands clenched in a fist as she read the words again, as if staring at them long enough would make them make sense. But they didn't. There was nothing reasonable about what had just happened. This wasn't just a violation of common sense. It was a direct attack on her son's right to exist in his own home, and the HOA thought they could get away with it. Shirley had spent years defending others in the courtroom, but now it was personal. Every case she had ever fought had been about justice, about ensuring that laws were not just words on paper, but protections for the people who needed them most. But this time, it was not about clients, legal arguments, or precedents. This was about her son. This was about an abuse of power that directly impacted her family, and she was not going to let it slide. With steady hands, she pulled out her phone and took photos of the notice, the empty space where the ramp once stood, and every possible angle that could serve as evidence. This was not going to be a simple battle of words. It was going to be a legal war, and she was going to make sure the HOA never forgot the mistake they had made. The first step was gathering all the legal documentation. She pulled out the original permits, the medical necessity letters, and the city's approval, all of which had allowed the ramp to be built in the first place. Every piece of paperwork was in order. Every requirement had been met. There was no loophole, no fine print, no reason for this to have happened other than a blatant disregard for her son's needs. She wasn't just angry, she was outraged. It had taken months to get that ramp installed, ensuring it was compliant with every regulation, and yet the HOA had removed it as if it was nothing more than an unsightly decoration. Her next move was to call the HOA office, demanding an explanation. The phone rang 3 times before a receptionist picked up, her voice neutral and indifferent. When Shirley introduced herself and stated the reason for her call, there was a moment of hesitation before she was told that the HOA president would need to address the matter personally. That was not acceptable. She insisted on speaking to someone immediately, but the receptionist repeated the same rehearsed line, saying that a written complaint could be submitted and reviewed at the next board meeting. As if this was just another minor dispute, as if a child's mobility had not just been taken away in an instant. Frustration burned in her chest as she ended the call. If they thought she was going to sit back and wait for some routine meeting, they were sorely mistaken. She was going to take action, and it was going to happen now. She opened her laptop and started typing, drafting legal notices, documenting every violation the HOA had committed, and preparing to take them to court if necessary. They had pushed the wrong person. The first person she needed to confront was the HOA president. Shirley had dealt with difficult people throughout her career, but there was something particularly infuriating about power-hungry individuals who believed they were untouchable simply because they held a title. She knew that the president, Margaret Caldwell, had been running the HOA like a personal empire for years, issuing fines over the smallest infractions and making life miserable for anyone who dared to question her authority. If Margaret thought she could bulldoze over Shirley's family the way she had done with others, she was about to get a harsh reality check. With her evidence folder tucked under her arm, Shirley marched to the HOA office, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked with unwavering determination. The receptionist barely had time to react before Shirley pushed open the door and stepped inside. "I need to speak with Margaret Caldwell," she stated firmly, her tone making it clear that she was not asking. The receptionist hesitated before stammering that Margaret was in a meeting, but Shirley was in no mood for games. She met the woman's gaze and said in a calm but undeniable voice that she would wait right there until the meeting was over. Whether it took 5 minutes or 5 hours, she was not leaving until Margaret answered for what had happened. It only took 2 minutes for the receptionist to cave and disappear into the back office. Moments later, the door swung open, and Margaret stepped out, her expression composed but her eyes carrying a flicker of annoyance. "Shirley, what a surprise," she said smoothly, though there was nothing welcoming in her voice. "I assume this is about the ramp?" Shirley didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pulled out the paperwork and placed it on the desk between them. The ramp was approved, legally permitted, and medically necessary. The HOA had no right to remove it. Margaret barely glanced at the documents before offering a rehearsed response, claiming that the ramp had been taken down due to noncompliance with neighborhood standards. "It disrupts the uniform aesthetic of the community," she added with a dismissive wave of her hand. Shirley's patience was razor-thin. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and controlled. "You removed an accessibility feature without notice, without warning, and without cause. That is not only unethical, but it is also illegal." Margaret's expression didn't falter, but Shirley could tell she had struck a nerve. This was the kind of person who thrived on intimidation, expecting others to back down. But Shirley wasn't just anyone. She was a Supreme Court judge, and she knew the law better than Margaret ever could. When Margaret attempted to brush off her concerns with another excuse, Shirley cut her off. "You will reinstate that ramp immediately," she stated. "If you do not, I will take legal action. This is not a threat. It is a promise." Margaret's face darkened slightly, her jaw tightening as she realized that Shirley was not someone she could push around. Still, she attempted one last move, stating that the matter would need to be reviewed by the HOA board and that Shirley would have to wait until the next meeting. Shirley held her gaze for a long moment before giving a small, knowing smile. "Then I hope you are ready for what comes next." Without another word, she gathered her paperwork and walked out, leaving Margaret standing there, visibly unsettled. By the time Shirley got home, she had already made several calls. She wasn't just preparing for a legal battle. She was ensuring that by the time this fight was over, the HOA would regret ever targeting her son. Her first call had been to a close colleague at the Department of Housing, someone well-versed in the legalities surrounding accessibility laws. As expected, they confirmed that the HOA had violated multiple federal and state regulations, making their actions not only unethical, but entirely illegal. The second call was to a city official, requesting an immediate review of the HOA's actions. And the third, the one that would likely deliver the biggest impact, was to a local journalist who had covered cases of HOA abuse before. If there was one thing Shirley understood better than most, it was that the court of public opinion often moved faster than the legal system. People might not always understand complex legal statutes, but they did understand the cruelty of an organization stripping away a child's independence over something as petty as aesthetics. If the HOA wanted to maintain its reputation, They were about to learn just how quickly public outrage could turn against them. As she sat at her kitchen table, reviewing the documents she had gathered, she heard the front door open. Jake rolled into the room, his frustration evident. "What did they say?" he asked, his voice laced with anger. Shirley set down her papers and met his gaze with unwavering determination. "They said no for now, but that won't last long." She watched as her son's shoulders tensed, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had always been strong, refusing to let his condition define him, but this was different. This was a reminder that there were still people in the world who saw him as an inconvenience rather than a person. Shirley refused to let him feel powerless. "We're going to fight this," she said firmly. "And we are going to win." The next morning, Shirley's plan was set in motion. The city officials had agreed to send an inspector to assess the violation, and the journalist she had contacted was eager to run a story on the abuse of power within the HOA. As she prepared for the day ahead, she received an unexpected email. It was from another resident in the neighborhood, someone she had spoken to only in passing. The message was short but powerful. "I saw what they did to your son's ramp. You're not the only one they've gone after. If you need witnesses, I'll speak up." That was all Shirley needed to see. She had known Margaret was controlling, but now it was clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern of abuse, and it was time to put an end to it once and for all. The city inspector arrived that afternoon. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, a clipboard in one hand, and an air of authority that suggested he had seen more than his fair share of HOA disputes. As Shirley led him to the front of the house, she could already see a few neighbors peeking through their windows, no doubt curious about what was happening. The inspector wasted no time getting to work. He measured the space where the ramp had once stood, took several photos, and jotted down notes as Shirley provided him with copies of the original permits and medical documentation. She watched as his expression shifted from neutral professionalism to something closer to frustration. "This shouldn't have been removed," he said, shaking his head. "There are federal protections in place for accessibility structures like this." Shirley nodded, her voice steady. "I know. That's why I need a formal report confirming the violation." He sighed, flipping through the documents before giving a firm nod. "You'll have it by the end of the day." Shirley thanked him, but before he could leave, another voice interrupted. "I hope you're not suggesting that the HOA did anything wrong." Margaret had appeared, arms crossed, her tone laced with feigned innocence. The inspector turned to her, unimpressed. "The law is very clear on accessibility structures. Removing this was a violation." Margaret's smile barely wavered. "The structure was never approved," she claimed. Shirley immediately held up the signed permits, her voice unwavering. "It was approved, legally." Margaret's expression tightened for the briefest moment before she quickly recovered. "Well, we'll have to see what the board decides." The inspector gave her a pointed look. "The law isn't up for board discussion. If the ramp isn't reinstated, there will be consequences." Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Margaret standing there, clearly unsettled. Shirley watched her carefully, noting the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Margaret had relied on fear and control for years, but this time, she was facing someone who wasn't going to back down. As Shirley walked back inside, her phone buzzed. The journalist she had contacted had just published the article. The headline was bold and unflinching. "HOA faces backlash after destroying disabled child's wheelchair ramp." The fight had just gone public. By the next morning, the article had spread further than Shirley anticipated. What had started as a local piece had been picked up by several larger news outlets, and now the HOA's actions were being discussed far beyond their quiet suburban neighborhood. The comments flooded in, people outraged at the blatant discrimination, legal experts weighing in on the clear violation of federal law, and even disability advocates calling for immediate action. The pressure was building, and Margaret had to be feeling it. Shirley didn't have to wait long for confirmation. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting had been announced, and according to the notice, the board would be discussing community concerns regarding recent events. That was all the proof Shirley needed to know that they were scrambling. When she arrived at the meeting later that evening, the room was more crowded than she had ever seen it. Normally, HOA meetings were sparsely attended, with only a handful of homeowners showing up to hear the latest rule changes and minor disputes. But tonight, the room was packed. People who had never spoken up before were now present, whispering among themselves, some holding printed copies of the article that had exposed the HOA's actions. Shirley took her seat near the front, her expression calm but unshakable. Margaret sat at the center of the board's long table, her usual confidence replaced with a forced neutrality. The moment the meeting was called to order, she launched into a carefully worded statement about how the HOA deeply regretted any misunderstandings and was committed to ensuring compliance with all relevant laws. It was clear that she was trying to control the damage, but Shirley wasn't going to let her manipulate the narrative. When the floor was open for comments, Shirley stood. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The weight of her words was enough. What happened to my son was not a misunderstanding. It was a violation of his rights, a violation of federal law, and an abuse of power by this board. You knew the ramp was legal, and you destroyed it anyway. A murmur spread through the room, neighbors nodding in agreement, some even voicing their support out loud. Margaret stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. But before she could respond, another homeowner stood up. Then another. People began sharing their own grievances, stories of excessive fines, arbitrary rules, and the overreach that had been tolerated for far too long. The illusion of control Margaret had maintained for years was crumbling. Shirley could see it in her eyes, the realization that she was no longer the one in charge. And then, just when Margaret seemed to be regaining her composure, the city inspector entered the room, official documents in hand. The ramp removal was illegal, he announced, and the HOA was formally ordered to restore it immediately. Margaret's face drained of color. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken, as if she had finally realized that this situation had spiraled out of her control. The inspector continued, stating in no uncertain terms that the HOA had violated federal accessibility laws and that failure to comply with the order to restore the ramp would result in legal consequences. The room was dead silent as his words settled over the crowd. Then, murmurs started spreading, neighbors exchanging glances, some whispering in disbelief. Margaret, however, remained stiff, gripping the edges of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "We will need time to review this," she said finally, her voice clipped. "The board will discuss." The inspector cut her off immediately. "This isn't up for discussion. The ramp must be reinstated. Noncompliance could result in lawsuits, fines, and further penalties." His tone left no room for argument. Shirley watched as Margaret's jaw clenched, her frustration barely concealed. But before she could try to argue further, another voice spoke up. "Enough of this." One of the HOA board members, an older man who had remained quiet until now, finally broke his silence. "We all know this never should have happened. We let things go too far, and now we're paying the price." His admission sent a ripple through the crowd, and another board member nodded in agreement. The pressure was mounting. Margaret was losing control. Shirley remained still, watching as the shift unfolded before her eyes. She had spent her career breaking down corrupt institutions, and she recognized this moment for what it was, the exact point when those in power realized they were outnumbered. More voices began speaking, residents stepping forward to share their grievances. Complaints that had been whispered in private were now being aired openly. Unfair fines, intimidation tactics, abuse of authority. It was as if a dam had broken. Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but it was obvious that the tide had turned against her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she exhaled sharply, then turned to Shirley. "The ramp will be reinstated," she said, forcing the words out as if they physically pained her. The words might have been a victory, but Shirley wasn't finished yet. "And?" she prompted, waiting. Margaret's eyes flashed, but she knew there was no way out of this. "And the HOA will cover the full cost of the replacement," she added begrudgingly. A satisfied murmur ran through the crowd, but Shirley wasn't done. She held her ground, staring at Margaret expectantly. "And an official apology," she said, publicly. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she knew she had no choice. "Fine," she bit out. "The HOA will issue a public apology." Shirley finally nodded, satisfied. The fight wasn't just about a ramp. It was about accountability, about ensuring that no other family in this neighborhood had to endure the same abuse of power. And now, the people who had caused this injustice were being forced to answer for it. The following week, the ramp was rebuilt. This time, it was done under city supervision, ensuring that the HOA had no way to interfere. Shirley stood by with Jake as the workers installed each piece, securing it properly and double-checking every measurement. The moment it was complete, Jake rolled forward, testing it out, his movements smoother than before. A small smile crossed his face, one that made Shirley's chest tighten with emotion. It was not just about the ramp. It was about the fact that he had been made to feel like he didn't belong, and now that was being undone. The HOA's forced apology arrived 2 days later. It was brief, carefully worded, and filled with legal jargon designed to protect them from liability, but it was still an admission of guilt. Margaret, who had once been the neighborhood's most untouchable figure, had been humbled in front of the entire community. But that wasn't the only consequence she faced. As Shirley had predicted, the fallout didn't stop at the ramp. The investigation into the HOA's financial practices had begun, triggered by the city's involvement in the case. Complaints that had previously gone ignored were now being reviewed, and it didn't take long for irregularities to surface. Unauthorized fines, missing funds, unapproved expenses, all signs of an organization that had operated without oversight for far too long. Margaret tried to contain the damage, but it was too late. The board, eager to distance themselves from her, held an emergency vote, and by the end of the month, she was officially removed as HOA president. A for sale sign appeared in front of her house shortly after, a silent but undeniable testament to her downfall. As Shirley watched the moving trucks pull away weeks later, she felt no sympathy. Margaret had built her power on intimidation and control, believing she was above the very rules she enforced. But in the end, justice had prevailed. Shirley had ensured it, and as she turned back toward her house, she saw Jake waiting at the top of the ramp, the same ramp no one would ever be able to take away again. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt different. Without Margaret's iron grip controlling every aspect of life, people seemed more relaxed, more willing to engage with one another. The HOA, now under new leadership, was forced to reevaluate many of its previous policies, and several of Margaret's most arbitrary rules were overturned. Homeowners who had once feared fines and retaliation were now making small improvements to their homes without the constant worry of a violation notice appearing on their doorstep. The community, once dictated by rigid control, was finally starting to feel like an actual neighborhood again. Shirley knew that her battle had set a precedent. The HOA had been reminded that power was not absolute, that rules existed to serve the people, not to control them. More importantly, they had learned that when they crossed a line, there would be consequences. Shirley had fought many legal battles throughout her career, but this one had been the most personal. It wasn't just about her son's rights. It was about ensuring that no one else in the neighborhood would have to endure the same mistreatment. As she stood by the front door, watching Jake move freely down the ramp, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had won, not just in the legal sense, but in a way that truly mattered. Her son had his independence back, and the people who had tried to take it away had been held accountable. The fight had been worth it, and if anyone ever tried to pull something like this again, they would know exactly who they were up against.